Hey y'all, I'm Lauren and welcome to Cantina Cast. Today I am so excited to talk about Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade. This is the latest novel by Delilah S Dawson. You might be familiar with this author's work from the novel Phasma, for example, but I've got to say that this novel, it really blew me away. Like, I'll just say that right now. This is definitely going to be one of my highlights of the year as far as Star Wars reading goes. And I'm really, really impressed with what this author has done with this story. At the beginning of this video, I'm going to talk about my general thoughts with no spoilers. And then before I start talking plot details and getting a little bit deeper into the story, I'll give you a warning so that way if you have not read this one yet and you're planning to, then you don't have to hear spoilers if you don't want to. Right off the bat, something that I really enjoyed about this story is that it just felt very fresh to me. We're dealing with a character that we've only seen very briefly before. She makes an appearance in the Vader comic, but other than that, the main character of the story, named Iskat Akaris, we don't really know a ton about her. We know based on the cover of the book and the title of the book that eventually she becomes an Inquisitor. But because this isn't a character that we went into this story like knowing a ton about, the story just felt very fresh for me. And I think that's a big part of the reason why, as I was reading it, I just really felt like I just had to know what was going to happen next, because it wasn't like, I kind of already knew exactly how her story was going to end up before I even started the book. That alone was enough to really keep me reading. And it's something that I feel like I at least haven't gotten a ton lately in my Star Wars reading. Like, for example, lately I've been reading a lot of High Republic, and the very nature of High Republic these days is that you do go into those stories knowing a lot more about those characters, so it was nice to have a change of pace with this story. Something else I really appreciated about this story as well is that we do spend quite a lot of this story in the Jedi Temple. So we start off with Iskat Akaris as a Padawan, and we see her through this progression of, as she's growing, she's becoming a Jedi Knight, and eventually we see the series of events that leads her to becoming an Inquisitor and how exactly all of that goes down. Something I appreciated about this story is that Delilah S Dawson did such a good job of balancing the kind of like the issue of, there were some problems going on in the Jedi Temple, without making it look like the Jedi just completely had everything all wrong. One thing that I felt like this book accomplished really well is showing that the Jedi are people. And even though, like, there's a lot of Jedi that do really genuinely try to do the right thing, that really do try to uphold the best parts of the Jedi code and are setting a good example, but at the same time, there's also some Jedi who unfortunately make some very human mistakes. Some of them, their mistakes go even a little bit farther than typical human mistakes. Like, there are just some Jedi that are just not good people. And you're going to get that with pretty much, to me, that felt very, very realistic, that some Jedi are great, some are awful. And unfortunately, we do see a little bit more of some of those awful Jedi coming in contact with Iskat, which does kind of lead her on the path that she ends up being led down. That part really did work well for me, because in the past I have been a little bit apprehensive about um a certain perspective making it look like the Jedi were completely all wrong and the whole institution was bad and that it was all just horrible from the start. Like, that perspective doesn't really work for me. I much prefer the perspective of, the Jedi, a lot of them had the right idea. A lot of them were really trying, but there also were those that were doing a pretty bad job and were being selfish and were making decisions from that sort of a place. If you are someone who has been a little bit apprehensive, a little bit concerned about how the Jedi might be portrayed in future Star Wars media, I want to encourage you that this book, I really feel like, does a great job of walking that balance without just doing a bunch of Jedi hating. Like, there were parts in this book where I could see where Iskat's issue was, and I could see kind of what she was saying and why she was mad. And then there were other parts of the book where I could kind of see what the Jedi were saying and I could see why they were concerned. So I just really felt like this book did a great job of presenting both sides. And that leads me to another thing that I really liked, which is that Iscott is a flawed character. There's times that I was reading this that I was kind of like wondering if maybe she's kind of a little bit of an unreliable narrator in a way. Like she has emotions and reactions based on things, but sometimes as the reader, you're kind of like, did it really? Is that really what this person was wanting to say with that? Is that really how it happened? And I just thought that was a really cool layer of this story is that sometimes you could see what Iscott was saying, but she wasn't too sympathetic. I mean, she is still an Inquisitor at the end of the day. And another thing that I felt like Delilah S Dawson did super well was throughout the story, planting the seeds of showing this progression to the dark side. It doesn't happen all of a sudden and it doesn't come out of nowhere. You can see how it's unfolding, and it's very believable to see how the character would end up in this situation because the author has been showing it to us this whole time. And that's something that really, really works well for me in a story is when I can look back and I could see those seeds being planted all along the way. And this author does that so well here. So, yeah, this story, it really does a great job of not only is it fresh and something a little bit different than what a lot of us have been reading lately with Star Wars, not only is it doing that, and not only is it giving us a new perspective, but the story is also just constructed very, very well. I would say the only thing to just keep in mind is that there are a few times in the story where Iscott's internal monologue, when she's kind of like ruminating about situations and kind of thinking about how things are affecting her and what she wants to do. There are a few times where that gets a little bit repetitive, especially when she's younger and she's first starting to question the Jedi. But it didn't ruin my reading experience or it didn't even really affect it negatively at all. It was kind of just something I noticed. So, if as you're reading this, if you're noticing that there are some parts that are a little bit repetitive, I encourage you to just stick with it. Just get through those repetitive parts because the payoff at the end of this story is really, really great. And the last thing I want to mention before I get into talking about spoilers for this book is that there is an author's note in the beginning of this book that discusses how there is a character in this story that does take their own life. It wasn't graphic, it wasn't in my opinion, it wasn't something that was excessive. And I mean, I'll be the first to say I do tend to be pretty sensitive about dark topics in my books. I'm just kind of a sensitive person. And for me, I felt like it was handled well by the author, but that is just something to be aware of if that's a topic that you tend to want to be a little bit more careful around. That topic does come up in this book. So that's my general thoughts on this book, and I am now going to start talking about plot details and spoilers. So if you don't want any spoilers, now is your time to turn back. The very beginning of this story opens right before the start of the Clone Wars. We meet Iscott as a Padawan, and we see that she's really kind of having a hard time just right off the bat. She's kind of like her master is being really strict with her in a way that feels a bit excessive. She's not really connecting with her master. She's feeling very unsure of herself, like a little bit more than would be typical for a Padawan at this stage. And the thing that's heartbreaking about all this is that she's really, really trying. She's really trying to do the right thing. She's really trying to be a good Padawan. And she's just feeling like nothing that she ever does is enough. And we soon find out that the reason that they're so strict with her and really controlling over her is because as a Padawan, there was an incident where she accidentally, like, force pulled a column down on top of another student. And it was just purely an accident, but the other instructors were shocked that a Padawan was able to do something like that because of how much strength it took for her to pull the column down, and also because she ended up really injuring that student that the column fell on top of. And so, ever since then, there's just a really big distrust of her, even though this incident was just purely an accident. Something else that's unusual too is that the other Jedi, they really, anytime that Iscott asks anything about her species or where she's from, they really shut it down very quickly. And that is something that we expect the Jedi to do because they don't want the students having attachment to their home worlds or their home families. But with Iscott, it feels like even more than usual. Like it feels like there's something that they're hiding about her. Iscott and her master Semberve are sent to Geonosis to rescue Obi-Wan, and the Battle of Geonosis ensues. And during this battle, Iscott demonstrates a really strong affinity for killing. There's Geonosins that they're fighting, and she is just picking them off like nothing. And the way that she is able to do this so easily, like she's just a natural at it, like she's just a natural warrior. This is another thing that does kind of freak out some of the other students because they're kind of like, why are you so good at that? Like, that's a little scary. There is one other student named Tualon who is Iscott's best friend at this point, and he seems to recognize the value that Iscott brings because later on in the story, he does talk about how we're at war, we need warriors like you. So he's pretty much the only student that isn't freaked out by Iscott's abilities, but he is there and witnesses this happen. And so he does end up being like one of the people that she's closest to going forward because he's one of the few people that really sees her for who she is. During the Battle of Geonosis, Iscott's master, Sember, is killed. And in her last moments, she mentions someone named Feyre. And she's almost like she thinks that Iscott is Feyre because she's probably hallucinating. And she's saying that, oh, I tried to help her, but she's too much like you, like I failed. And so this sets off pretty much a journey through the whole rest of the book of Iscott trying to figure out who Feyre is. It is also influenced by after Sember's death, when Iscott is clearing out Sember's belongings, she finds a lightsaber that seems to have been made for the size of her species hands. So not only is there somebody named Feyre who Sember felt like she owed a debt to, but Iscott has a pretty good inkling that Feyre was also her own species, so maybe they were related in some way. And Iscott tries to find information about Feyre in the archives. She asks some other Jedi Masters about this, but everybody shoots her down. She can never find any information about Feyre. And so that alone is frustrating, but also in addition to that, the way that Sember's death is handled and the aftermath of that, and just the way that Iscott is watching how the Jedi are being spread so thin during the Clone Wars, that is adding to Iscott's frustration of the Jedi. And this particular issue of them trying to be like, there is no death, them trying to just like hurry up and move on from these tons and tons of Jedi Masters that got killed in the Battle of Geonosis, that is something that really is what started off Iscott's questioning of the Jedi. Because up until this point, she's really been trying to make it work. And she really felt like the problem was with her. But now after this, she's starting to feel like, okay, maybe there's a little bit more to this issue. Like, why is it that the Jedi are handling things in this way? And on one hand, when I was reading this, I did feel for the Jedi because it's not like they want things to go down in this way. It's not like they want to be sending kids to go fight a war. But with the way that the situation just ended up, this is just what they ended up being forced to do. And unfortunately, the consequences of that are that there were Padawans who were left behind, like Iscott, who didn't really get the training that they needed. They ended up just kind of getting blown off and didn't really have someone to really spend the time with them and really work with them. Because after Simber's death, there is a time where Iscott is hoping for another master because she felt like with Simber, they never really connected, and that is something that affected Iscott's training because Simber kind of always was acting like Iscott was a burden. She wasn't really putting her heart and soul into teaching her. And so Iscott was hoping that maybe she could get another master, but because of the way the Clone Wars are going, it's just not possible. She's pretty much just left to fend for herself and just try to figure stuff out on her own. And this is a part in Iscott's life where I do feel like if she had had the proper guidance, I feel like that she probably would have been able to have been saved from the dark side because that's really just what she wanted was someone to just spend the time with her, explain things to her and really work with her, and she just never got that. And so because of that, because she was left to just figure things out for herself, all of her frustrations just ended up simmering over time. And unfortunately, a part of that is that Iscott is made a Jedi Knight which is very obviously before she is ready. But the Jedi Council was so desperate for more Jedi Knights because of how many that they were losing to the war that they ended up just making a whole bunch of Padawans Jedi Knights and just kind of hoping for the best. Once she becomes a Jedi Knight, one of her first missions is that they want her to shut down a droid factory. And the key to this mission is that they want it to be discreet. And the council explicitly tells her, don't make a big deal, like just do this quietly. And she goes with a group of Jedi Knights to go take care of this. And the mission ends up going bad. And what pretty much ends up happening is because they received some bad intel, which was very vague to begin with, and then some of it ended up just being straight up wrong. And so, because of the way that the mission went bad when they were there, um, Iscott ended up bombing the factory instead of just shutting it down. And so when they have to go report this back to the council, they're very frustrated and because they feel like she just disobeyed them pretty blatantly. And because of that, they make her take a step back from her duties. She is now a youngling instructor. At this point in the story, we did get a Keller and Beck name drop, which that had me so excited. Love Keller and Beck. So that made me smile in the midst of this very tragic story. But Iscott is like, once again, she's really trying to put her best foot forward with training the younglings. And it's just not what she's meant to do. Like, she still really feels like she's meant to be a warrior on the front lines of battle. It's what she's good at. It's what she enjoys, which is a little problematic from like a Jedi perspective or also just from a killing people is bad perspective, but she feels like she is good at killing and she gets like an excitement from it. And of course, like her excitement about killing, it is just like every time she gets excited about killing and is kind of like relishing that and really thinking deeply about that, it is just kind of like one more step along the path of the dark side. And even though she's trying to do what the council has asked of her by taking a step back and trying to kind of like be more calm and like focus on that, she still can't let go of what she feels like her purpose is, which is to be a warrior. Eventually, the council does decide to give her another test. After a while of her having to take a step back, they decide, well, we do need Iscott to help us. And she's been in timeout for a while, so let's bring her back. Let's give her another mission and see how she does. And this next mission, the leader of the mission is actually Tualon, who was her childhood friend. And she also like has kind of a crush on him too, so she's looking forward to it for that reason too, even though she's also kind of like, that's going to be a little bit weird that he's like the boss of me. But she's going into it really ready to prove herself, really wanting to do a good job because she knows that if something goes bad with this mission, she's done. Not only will she not get to be a warrior anymore, but she probably won't get to be a Jedi anymore either. This time the mission does end up going well. But during the mission, there was a close call where, pretty much, long story short, the reason that the mission was successful is because of Iscott's decision making in a pinch. And when they go back to the council, Tualon pretty much gives the council the short and sweet version of what happened. He doesn't explicitly say, like, oh, we were in a bad situation and Iscott got us out of it. He doesn't say all that because he's just kind of giving the council the information that they need to know. He doesn't want to complicate it. For me, as I was reading, it was easy for me to understand why he presented the information the way that he did. And this part of the story is a pretty good example of what I was talking about earlier about how the author really balances it well in terms of like sometimes you can see like why Iscott is frustrated, and other times you're kind of like not agreeing with her. At least that's how I felt, but I liked it that it was that way. I don't like it when a character is just totally one way or the other. I like it when there's a little bit of like gray area and sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous as to who is actually correct in the situation, and I appreciated this moment because of that reason. But because Tualon gives the council the short version of the story and doesn't credit Iscott, she becomes very angry about that. She even calls it a betrayal. She feels like he betrayed her trust. She feels like he took credit for the mission going well, even though to me it didn't come across that way at all. It just came across like he didn't want her to get in trouble for making a rash decision because in this case the rash decision just happened to pay off, but in the past the council did have issues with her making rash decisions in the first place. And so I interpreted it as he was trying to protect her, but Iscott just really took it personally. And the way that she gets angry and like sees herself as a victim in the situation, this is just another example of like one more step along the path to the dark side. And this resentment towards Tualon, it does stick around in a big way because Order 66 happens not long after this. And when it happens, Palpatine offers Iscott answers and freedom. And Palpatine, he actually knew that Iscott was frustrated with the Jedi because he had planted a spy in the Jedi Temple, and Iscott had been previously confiding in this spy. His name was Hezo. And pretty much what she would do is whenever she was frustrated about the Jedi Council, sometimes she would run into Hezo in the courtyard that she liked to sit in, and she would just kind of vent to him. And Hezo would kind of like be like a listening ear, and it sounded like there were times that he was kind of nudging her a little bit closer along the path of the dark side. And then we find out that he was truly doing that later in the story because we find out that he was a spy. So because of Hezo's intel, Palpatine knew that Iscott was frustrated, and he knew that she would be a good candidate for being an Inquisitor. So during Order 66, Palpatine approaches her and is like, I'll offer you answers and freedom if you join me. And by this time, she's already hating the Jedi so much. Um, some of which is like understandable, some of which is not understandable. And she resents Tualon so much that she actually goes with Palpatine and she leaves Tualon to die. Because when Order 66 was happening, it just so happened that she was with Tualon at that time. And so when she's leaving to go with Palpatine, the last thing that she sees of Tualon is him alone surrounded by clones. And it's him being like, are you actually going to leave me here? And she pretty much has no empathy for him at all because she believed that he had betrayed her that time. And so she leaves him to die out of her own anger and resentment towards him. And that pretty much feels like that's like the defining moment of her joining the dark side. Throughout the story, we do see lots of moments where she gets a little bit closer, times where she could have intervened in something and chose not to, times when she chose anger instead of trying to deal with something a little bit more effectively. We've just seen a lot of moments like this in her story up until this point, but once she decides to join Palpatine and leaves Toulon to die, it feels like her transition to the dark side at that point is sealed now. And then this is the part where we actually really get to see her becoming an Inquisitor and how exactly that works. And this is something where we got to see kind of like the day to day of the Inquisitors and how they were found, how they were recruited, what that recruitment was like. And it's a pretty nightmarish scenario. Like, we quickly find out that Iscott does not actually have freedom by joining them, and she's one of the lucky ones in terms of she was just recruited like normal, but there were other Inquisitors that were forced to come and they were tortured and brainwashed to hate the Jedi. And all the Inquisitors are competing against each other. The way that they learn to fight, or the way that they enhance their fighting skills, because a lot of them, of course, already knew how to fight, but the way that they grow in learning to fight by using the dark side is fighting each other, injuring each other. I mean, Iscott ends up in the med bay many times in this book just from dueling with other Inquisitors. And even at one point, Iscott duels Vader himself. And this was a pretty cool part of the story because the author really does a great job of just illustrating the sheer power of Vader. And there's times during this duel when Iscott is fighting him where she's able to walk away from the duel in one piece, but at least for the most part, but she realizes that Vader is so powerful that she can't foresee a way of beating him. Like, she's lucky to even have survived the duel. And the author just does a really good job of illustrating just the power of Vader and just showing it on the page. Eventually, Iscott does finally get a chance to go visit her home planet. And this is when she's off duty. It's before she is given her first Jedi hunting assignment as an Inquisitor, but she is able to like take some time and just go visit her home planet, which she was able to at least get the name of, which is Picori. What she finds is a civilization that is very disconnected from space travel, and they almost sound kind of like maybe a Stone Age society. And they live in a community and they just sound like a very peaceful people. So, totally different from how Scott is. And when she gets there, she immediately has like a very deep connection with her family members. She is actually able to locate her family and they really want her to stay. And unfortunately, she's not able to stay because she's worried about the Inquisitors coming looking for her and killing everybody in the village. But she's also feeling like, in addition to it being a fear thing, she also is kind of like, if I live here, I'm not going to be able to do what I truly want to do, which is hunt Jedi and be a warrior. And so she's also on the like on one hand it's she wants to protect them, but on the other hand she's not really ready to give up the Inquisitor lifestyle anyway. So she does end up having to leave, but before she leaves, she does finally get the story of what happened to Feyre, or at least a pretty big part of the story. What she's told by her grandmother is that Feyre was taken to be a Jedi when she was young, and then she was trained as a Jedi for a while, but she failed her Padawan trials. She had the option to stay at the Jedi Temple and work in the temple, but not as a Jedi. But she felt like she couldn't do that. Like she just had to go home. She wanted to go home, trying to figure out what she was going to do next. But she really just felt lost because Feyre really wanted to be a Jedi. And it just turned out that she wasn't allowed to do that. So when she went home, she was trying to make the best of the situation, but she was just miserable because she felt like she had missed her purpose in life. But eventually she does have Iscott, and once Iscott is born, she seems to have become a little bit more of her old self again. But that's all ripped away when it turns out that Iscott is also force sensitive. And then Feyre is once again confronted with, what am I like? I missed the chance to be a Jedi. Am I going to send my baby to be a Jedi, or like what am I going to do here? So this is a decision that she has to wrestle with, has to try to figure out what's the right thing, which sounds like a really hard decision from her shoes. And eventually she does decide to send Iscott to become a Jedi. And because Simber was Feyre's friend, that is why Simber took on Iscott, is to try to help Iscott avoid the same thing that her mother fell into, which is failing her trials because she really didn't have a good control over her emotions. And unfortunately, what happens is this ends up kind of being like a self fulfilling prophecy because Simber didn't take Iscott on because she felt like the Force was leading her to do so. She took Iscott on out of obligation. And so Iscott could just always tell that something wasn't right. And so that feeling is what eventually led to Iscott not being able to really control her emotions and not having a good grasp of what it truly means to be a Jedi because nobody really explained that to her well. And so all of that was really tough for Iscott to hear because it's kind of just giving her more ammunition as to what her frustrations and anger with the Jedi is all about. It's just giving her like one more example of somebody that the Jedi failed. And so when she leaves this planet, she's glad that she has the information, but she still is like very much an Inquisitor. She's ready to like take on her duty as an Inquisitor to go find Jedi because she fully believes that not only did they fail her and her mother, but based on what she's learned since becoming an Inquisitor, they've also brainwashed her into believing that the Jedi betrayed the Republic too. After this visit on her home planet, she is hit with a crazy shock, which is that Toulon actually survived. And she actually runs into him, and he is now an Inquisitor. And unfortunately, she can tell that he was one of the Inquisitors that the way that he became an Inquisitor was based on him being tortured and brainwashed rather than him just having a natural sort of frustration with the Jedi anyway. Because when he was a Jedi, he did seem like one of the good ones. Like he seemed like he was trying to do the right thing and like trying to just genuinely be a good person. But as an Inquisitor, he's totally changed. And during this confrontation with Iscot, Tualon actually stabs her. And so once again, Iscot ends up back in the med bay. Once she gets out of the med bay, she is given her first assignment of actually hunting down Jedi. She actually finds out that the Jedi were Charlene, who was a Padawan who kind of bullied Iscot when they were kids. And then also Master Clephon, who was a Jedi Master who is one of those Jedi that failed Iscot by doing the whole once Simber died, like his main thing that he did that really got under her skin was he kept being like, there is no death and don't mourn and all of that. And that was one of the things that really negatively affected her. So she has a lot of resentment towards him as well. And he's one of the people where, like, you do understand why Iscot hates him. Like, I could see, I mean, obviously, like, I don't think he deserved to be brutally murdered for it, but like, but you can see like why Iscot is frustrated and why she blames him for a lot of what happened to her. And so Iscot does successfully hunt them both down. She kills Charlene and she gets a lot of satisfaction out of it. So that's her getting stronger in the dark side. And then she also, before she kills Master Clephon, she does get a little bit more about Feyre's story from him. And what he tells her is that they did have very real concerns about Feyre, about Iscot ending up like Feyre. Because, of course, with Feyre being Iscot's mother, they had like a similar temperament. And he also felt like the dark side was strong in the both of them. And so he was kind of like, he really was also just adding more fuel to Iscot's fire the way that he was saying all of this because he's just emphasizing like, oh, like we never trusted you. And he is ultimately the one who tells Iscot that her mother Feyre took her own life because this situation was something that she felt was beyond her capacity to be able to handle and endure. Because not only did she feel like she had failed in what she wanted to be her purpose in life, but she also was really afraid of failing her daughter in the same way. And so when she kills him, of course, once again she feels no remorse because she feels like that he had it coming. And this conversation with them, it does kind of raise the question of, was Iscot destined for the dark side, or was this a self-fulfilling prophecy? And I tended to kind of fall more in the camp of, I felt like this was a self-fulfilling prophecy because in other places in Star Wars canon, we see other Jedi Masters talking about how the dark side exists within everybody, but everybody has to make a choice as to what they're going to put their time and energy into. Are they going to put their energy into living in the light, or are they going to feed the dark side? And that is a question that I really always enjoy getting into. And for me, I definitely feel like the light side and the dark side is a choice. And even though Iscot seems to believe that she was just destined for the dark side from the get-go, the way that the events took place and the way that it all went down and decisions that were made over time, it kind of had me thinking that the way that she ended up going to the dark side was really more because of a self-fulfilling prophecy of, they were worried about her being on the dark side because of her mother Feyre, but because they were so worried about it and were so controlling of her, they really just alienated her from everybody else and kind of created like the perfect conditions that lead someone to want to try out the dark side. And after Iscot successfully pulls off this mission, she finally is ready to take up her Inquisitor name, which is the 13th sister. And that, her revealing her name as the 13th sister and her taking up this name proudly, that was the end of the novel before the actual epilogue. And I mean, it's powerful too because I mean, of course, like, I never want to see a character go to the dark side. I want everybody to find the light in the end. That's just I don't know, I guess that's just how I am, but her like really just embracing this side, and I mean, for better or worse, and becoming the 13th sister, It was a really fascinating progression to see, especially the way that the author laid it all out. And it raised some really interesting questions about the dark side and about where the Jedi went wrong and like how they had failed other students also like Iscott. And so I just loved her story for those things that it brought up. And then we get into the epilogue. And the epilogue is what happens is that Vader gets a sense that Iscott and Tualon are getting closer. So in the epilogue, we do jump forward in time. Iscott and Tualon are like, they're in a relationship now. And it's almost kind of like when he stabbed her, it kind of like wiped the slate clean for both of them. Like they were even. So they kind of got to start over, which is pretty messed up, but that's pretty much what happened. And they're in a relationship now. Vader has picked up on it, and Vader is now messing with them because he can tell and he wants to see what they're going to do. And once Vader knows the truth, a chase ensues because Vader's pretty much ready to just get rid of them because it's a weakness. I mean, we can understand why he thinks that because of what happened to him personally. But a chase ensues on the streets of Coruscant, and Iscott and Tualon during this chase, they make the decision that we got to kill Vader, which is like, okay, good luck with that. He does catch up with them. And the way that Iscott's life ends is that Vader has her and he has Tualon, and he's like force holding them both. And then when they're like next to each other, he ignites both of their lightsabers into each other. So it's kind of like they end up killing each other because Vader made them do it. At this point in the story, when they're both dying, this is the first time in Iscott's life where she really has felt like she is truly free. And she's truly finally leaving behind her painful past and her painful life as an Inquisitor, which ultimately never brought her the freedom that it promised. And the only way that she can actually be at peace is for her life to be over. The epilogue ending on that note, it really just shows that it's not all it's cracked up to be. Ultimately, Iscott never got what she wanted because she was failed by the Jedi, and then she was looking for what she wanted in the wrong place at the end. It ended up just never really being worth it for her. She always thought that maybe one day it would be, but that day just never came. And her story really is a tragedy in that way. But I was so impressed with this story because of the way that it presented this character, just the all of the different aspects of this character that we get to see, the questions that it raised about the Force, about the Jedi, about the light side and the dark side, about where people went wrong, about what could have been done to have saved Iscott. Was it possible to save her? Was she just destined for the dark side from the start, or was it a self-fulfilling prophecy? This book really got me thinking in a way that a Star Wars book really hasn't got me to do in a while. So I mean, it was great for that reason. And Delilah S Dawson just handled this story with just so much skill. Just the way that it was told was just great. And the way that it was all laid out was fantastic. I could see myself actually reading this one again and kind of coming back to some of those questions and seeing what I think, a second time through, because I mean, this character, there's really a lot to her story, and there's a lot to the way that she reacts to things and the way that she interprets what's going on. There's just so much there. It's just got a lot of layers to it, which I really appreciated. And I was just really into this reading experience for that reason. But if you've read this book, let me know what you think about it. I'm really excited to talk about this book with people because I feel like it's one of those books where there's a lot to talk about. And I'm interested to see like if people interpreted any parts of it a little bit differently than I did, because I think that this story does lend itself to that. I think you could interpret these things differently. So yeah, definitely please let me know what you think of it. I'm excited to talk about this story with y'all. And thank y'all so much for joining, and I hope that y'all have a great rest of your day. Bye guys.